Hello, Humane Marketers. Sarah Znakrocha here. Welcome to another episode of the Humane Marketing Podcast, a place to be for the generation of marketers who cares. This is the show where we talk about marketing your business in a way that feels good to you, is aligned with your values, and also resonates more with your conscious customers because it's not pushy, ethical, and also beautiful. So if you're a regular here, you know that I'm organizing the conversations around the 7 Ps of humane marketing. And if you're new here and this is your first time, welcome. I'm so excited you're here. You may want to download your one-page marketing plan with the 7 Ps of humane marketing in the form of a mandala at humane.marketing/one page, the number one and page. So again, humane.marketing/one page. And with that, with no further ado, let's dive into today's conversation. Hi, Lisa. How are you today?
Hi, Sarah. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm so happy to have this conversation. It's is there a second or third? At least I know that I was on your podcast earlier. And so now I get the pleasure to have you on mine, which is wonderful. And we chose this topic of storytelling, which I know is close to your heart. And so I wanted to know if you have always considered yourself a good storyteller. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I've always considered myself a storyteller, not necessarily a good storyteller, mainly because of my age, because definitely before the internet, we didn't even have a colour TV until Dad bought one home for the Montreal Olympics. Now, that was a long time ago. So I grew up on stories when I was little, and then that carried on into my sort of late teenage years and early 20s when I began my nurse training. So when I became a nurse at a young age, I was 17 and a half, we didn't have counselling, we didn't have psychology services, we had to suck it up and get on with it. So when we had a bad day and we saw a lot of trauma, which you do when you're a nurse, you're working in acute care, the only outlet we really had in order to debrief with our colleagues about our day was through stories. So stories also can be used to heal as well. So I guess that I became a natural storyteller, and it was then later in life that I joined the pieces of the puzzle together and got more interested in helping entrepreneurs and business owners and even large organizations in how to tell several different stories, their own story, their signature story, their leadership story, and the story about their brands and their services and products. So I've definitely learnt how to tell stories better, but I think we are all storytellers. We all have the information that we need. We've got a lifetime of stories. It's just learning how to get those out and feel comfortable sharing the stories.
Wow. What does reading have to do with storytelling, right? Because when we're reading, we're not actually, telling a story, but we're definitely absorbing the story. So were you also a big reader?
I was a big reader, and I think that today definitely reading helps you to experience the characters and the landscapes and the plot and the story in a very sensory way. And of course, we need that sensory language. But I think that we need to always be mindful that writing is very, very different to speaking. And when somebody reads from a page or speaks something that they have completely memorized or that it's been written to be read, it doesn't sound right when it's spoken. So definitely, yes, read to immerse yourself in characters and sensory language, but never read your story out loud.
Okay, that's interesting. So it helps to tell better stories, I guess, because I noticed that when writing my own book, it helps to, I'm an avid reader. Like I read so many books, just like you. I know that you're always posting about the latest books you're reading. And,
Yeah.
and yeah, I think reading books definitely also then helps you with writing because you just kind of know, the turns of phrases, you just kind of
yeah, it's just kind of flows better, I guess, as compared to if you weren't reading at all. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
true with the storytelling that it's not the same if you read your story, obviously.
And you definitely don't need to be a good writer because that can be a barrier for many people. A lot of my stories, I don't even write down. I just use my phone. I hit voice record. I've got an idea for a story. I'll just speak it into a voice memo. I might be walking around or doing something. I get an idea in my head, or I'll draw it. I like doing little graphics. So if you don't consider yourself to be a good writer, doesn't mean to say you can't share stories.
I think that's a good reminder for people because sometimes we do get stuck with
We
the
do.
writing, right? And
Yeah.
another thing people tell me about my books is like it's an easy read. And so at the beginning I was like, is that a compliment or like a hidden criticism? But I do kind of write like I would speak, right? And
Yeah.
so I'm not, a novel writer, definitely not. And so I think for stories, if we think about, social media, it these stories need to be told exactly how you would tell them, I guess, in spoken words. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it
Mhm.
makes it more authentic, makes it more real. And I think that's definitely a compliment, Sarah. If somebody says that it's an easy read, that's good. Nobody wants a
Okay.
hard read that they've got to struggle to get their head around. So that's awesome. Well done.
Thank you. Yeah, and, like the inner critic voice kind of like, well, I
Mm.
wanted it to be sophisticated, but yeah, no, that's not who I am. How do we then know which stories to tell? Because I think I even notice myself sitting, I use mainly LinkedIn. And so I sit there and go, okay, what kind of story can I tell? And you're surrounded by stories all day long. But then when it comes to actually sharing them, your brain kind of blocks you and you're like, well, which one?
Yeah. I think the best thing that I like to do and I encourage others to do is to start a story bank, just like a piggy bank. You're collecting your stories. They may only be little snippets of information or anecdotes or examples, and you just store them up somewhere. Some people use a notebook or an index card system or an app like Evernote or OneNote. And so you're capturing your stories. And then when you want a story down the track to illustrate a particular point, you've got lots of material at hand. And stories they've got a reason, they've got a season. And the most important thing about a story is it's got to be ready to tell. It's got to be ripe. It's got to be that perfect moment, because there may be stories in our lives that for whatever reason we're not yet ready to share. And I think that we've always got to remember that we're the curators of our own stories, and we get to choose which stories to tell and who we're going to share them with. But the most important thing of all is the story that we're telling ourselves. So we've got to get rid of our own negative narratives and those stories that don't help us in order to be able to step up and speak and share, whether that's marketing your book or writing your book or believing yourself or putting out things in business. So we've really got two sorts of stories. We've got our internal stories and our own narratives, and we've got the stories that we share. So I think it can be hard, just like it can be hard to sit in front of a blank workbook and come up with some writing. Same with finding stories. But if you start collecting stories, like have a bank of them, then you'll never run out.
Yeah, that's a good idea. It could be like a notebook, but it could also be like snippets. If you're more into using online tools, it could be Evernote or whatever, Trello board,
Yeah.
whatever you're using. Yeah.
Or even Pinterest or voice notes. Voice
Mhm.
notes are great because they sync across all your devices. It doesn't matter where you are, you can hit record and just
Right.
do a 60-second voice note and give it a tag or a keyword, and you'll be able to find it again. So that's the important thing, particularly as you get older, is you might see something or hear something, oh, that'll make a great story, and you forget all about it. So not only you want to quickly capture the essence of that story, but you also want to take a moment and tune into how that story made you feel,
Mm.
because it's that emotion that has that impact. So you ask yourself, if you see something and you think, that's not right, or Isn't that wonderful? It's evoked an emotional response in you. So it's important when we capture our story to also put, and I felt joy, or I felt gratitude, or I felt frustrated or angry about something that's happening, because that will also help you when you are then telling your story. You're reliving that story and that experience to dial into that emotion that you felt at the time.
Yeah, so good. So many different things I want to kind of go back to that you just said. So the first thing is obviously the emotion. Yeah, that's where we connect, right? If we're telling a story, and for example, what I sometimes see is stories being told in the third person, like on someone's website, the about page, for example. If I read an about page and it's in the third person, there is no emotional connection. I don't feel connected to the person. And so I think that would probably be a first. I don't know if you agree, this telling your story obviously in your first person.
Absolutely. Yeah. Present tense, first person is always better.
Mhm.
And often when I'm coaching people in their story, and we might do the, stop, stop, start, when I'm coaching them, they might say something like, and then we broke up and I moved to America. And I go, hang on, you broke up. How did you feel?
Mm, yeah,
I was devastated. I couldn't stop crying for a week. They were brushing over that emotion.
right.
And that's the important part. Even if you don't decide to share it all, but you've still got to think about, okay, how did you feel when you got that call and the breakup happened?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's so good. I think you're right. We're wanting to kind of quickly get our story out there, and so we just kind of share headlines. And when you read it, it's like, nothing happens. Where on the other hand, you don't have to exaggerate. As the humane marketer, I'm always careful also about using pain points in stories and
Oh,
things like
yeah.
that. So you don't have to exaggerate feelings either, and make people feel bad or worse. But yeah, that's how we connect, is with the emotion and with the feelings. The other thing you brought up is this idea, I guess, kind of vulnerability, because you said there's every story has a reason and a season. And I love that. It's such a good way to remember, what's the reason of the story, and is it the right season, I guess, to tell the story. And that goes with timely current events out there, I guess, but it's also for ourselves. Do I feel like I am willing to share the story or not? So what's your take on vulnerability, and probably also kind of this
Mm.
trend of sharing too much information to get something in
Yeah,
return?
that has become very apparent. The work of the wonderful Brene Brown. Brene Brown has been around for a long time, but her work was popularized through the Netflix series. And I think that your vulnerability became the word. And I think there is a very fine line between vulnerability and oversharing.
Right.
And we do need to be ready to tell our story. If you are standing in front of a group of people and you cannot get through your story without breaking down and falling apart, probably not the right time to tell your story. You probably haven't done the inner work, you haven't done enough growing, you haven't done enough healing. Now, we can get caught off guard and our emotions can bubble to the surface, but generally you've got to have done the inner work. And then I also see, I've been in audiences where somebody's done the inner work and they feel that their story is ready to share, but they haven't really thought about how their story is potentially going to land and impact with the audience. We don't want to trigger our audience and leave them walking out feeling low and feeling horrid. So we've got to carefully craft that story, that even if we're sharing a story that doesn't have a happy ending, and that's life, not every story has to have a happy ending, but we are leaving the audience with something to take away that is inspirational or poignant or has a real meaning and purpose to it. So every story does need to have a carry out. Yeah. So I think that there's a very fine line with the vulnerability and the potentially oversharing. But at the end of the day, it's got to feel right for you, because if you're up in front of an audience, whether it's in front of a camera or on stage, and you feel as though you've got to push yourself to be more vulnerable, you're going to look awkward and uncomfortable. If that's how you feel inside, people are going to see that. And then if you're up the front looking awkward and uncomfortable, how does that make your audience feel? They
Yeah.
feel awkward and uncomfortable too, right? So it's really picking that right time. It's tough.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. And I would go even further and say, there's been marketers, unfortunately, also who kind of are in this authenticity trend and then use stories with a lot of vulnerability in order to get something, to, sell more of them or sell more of their coaching or and
Yeah.
so that's also not what we want from our audience. We don't want to use our story in a way that gets something. We want to, yes, connect with our audience, make sure that they resonate with our story, but not in a manipulative way. Like I've seen
True.
this trend where marketers start telling all these old stories just because, one guy started telling that he was abused when he was 7 years old. And then all of a sudden it was like one after the other. And so you start to actually question the truth of these stories, which is sad because,
Mm.
who knows, maybe they were all true, but it kind of became this thing where we felt like, what's going on here? This is a marketer. Is he doing this, for a reason and for the wrong reason, maybe?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, these days people have got more of a BS meter that they can possibly sense when one of those stories is
Yeah.
coming. And people switch off to that these days, I believe.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. The BS meter the last 2 years
Yeah.
for sure has gone up a lot. And so yeah,
Mm.
I just I think that's also, I told you before we started recording, I'm kind of not a big fan anymore of this idea of the hero arc story, where
Mm.
they started to feel like all the same to me, where there's a struggle, we overcome it, and then there's a huge happy ending, and now I'm a millionaire and I don't have any problems anymore. To me, even if that's true, that's just not an interesting story to me anymore. And yet it's used and recommended in coaching a lot. So
Mm.
what's your take on kind of these artificial stories?
Yeah, I think that it definitely helps to have a structure to your story and have a framework, particularly if you are learning to tell stories. It does give you some guidelines. You don't have to follow the arc from one point to another. You can start at any point, really. I think that definitely a story does need to have an element of tension. A story does need to have some conflict and some change. So every story is evidence of a transformation that's taken place. But the thing is, people think about struggle and conflict as huge. People think about transformation as I became a millionaire, I climbed Everest, I conquered the world. No, it can be a very small transformation. It can be somebody said something and that made you think about your own behavior or your actions, and you decided to do things differently, or you decided to apologize. That's a transformation. So it doesn't have to be huge. You don't have to have a rags to riches story to make a great storyteller. The best stories are in the simple. The best stories are in the ordinary. If you think about a trip to the supermarket, particularly in the tough times that we're in now, you navigate a whole lot when you're just getting to go out these days. A ride on public transport, an interaction with a stranger, a customer service experience, they're all possible stories that you can tell. And we certainly want to move away from stories that are all about me. Nobody wants to hear an all about me story. Nobody cares about your story until they care how much your story helps them.
Right.
So we also need to be mindful of that. What's the point? What's the purpose of your story? We need to set an intention in all of our speaking, even more so in our storytelling. So I do
So
like the arc. I do like some frameworks and formulas, and I certainly sort of teach modifications of those. But just think about the small things, because the
mhm.
small things that are more ordinary are more relatable.
Yeah, I like that a lot. What I also did in the marketing like we're human book, instead of telling this hero arc story, I told the beginning of the hero arc story. And then I said, look, I'm still in the middle of this thing, right? I'm not there yet. And I feel like this really connects with a lot of my readers because they can relate. They're like, look, she's not the hero. She's just like us in the middle of figuring things out. She has a message to share, but it's not like, oh, she's now made it and has figured it all out. So I feel like instead of always sharing stories where we have figured it all out,
Mm.
these smaller stories, like you mentioned before, that really show we're human as well and we're just in the middle of things just like everybody else. Those are the stories that really speak to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's often a good story will have somebody else as the hero in that story. And you as the business owner or the leader or the organization, you're the mentor in the story. You're the guide. You're the guru who offers a hand out and a help to somebody else to make their life better. So you can also think about where you want to position yourself in the story, and often the best place for you is as the mentor, so you're really shining a light on somebody else's journey.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there's a little piece about how you helped, but that's very much in the background.
Us introverts, we really like that, right? We like to shine
Mm,
the lights on others.
definitely.
It's not
Yeah,
all about us. Yeah, I love that.
definitely.
What about your story then? I know it. I kind of read it a bit in the intro, but I would love for you to explain a bit about your story.
Yes, I began my career as a midwife. I'm from London and I trained as a nurse and became a midwife, and then I specialized and became a neonatal intensive care midwife. And I always wanted to be a nurse. I knew that I wanted to be a nurse, and that was to be my forever career. And it was through my career that I got the opportunity to move to Australia, and I spent almost 2 decades working as an intensive care midwife. So much joy helping to bring new life into the world and look after tiny babies on life support. And then one day my life changed drastically when a virus destroyed most of my hearing. I was left with a tiny amount of sound on one side only. And because the intensive care environment is very technical, very challenging and demanding, I could no longer do that job. So I literally had to reinvent myself and think, what on earth am I going to do? And that was tough. I was already 40, wondering, who's going to have me? What am I going to do? And also navigating permanent and severe hearing loss. I got on a research trial and I got the amazing gift of a cochlear implant. And that was the beginning of me learning to hear and speak all over again in a very different
Wow.
way. And that was a very long journey. And it was in that journey, rehabilitating using the cochlear implant, that I got interested in speaking. And I started to sign up with mentors and coaches and various programs from around the world, and went on this speaking journey and reconnected with my love of storytelling, and then decided that I wanted to be a speaker coach and a storyteller and a professional speaker, and to also teach and help others. So these days I work with leaders, helping leaders to have high impact communication skills, presentation skills, speaking, and of course business storytelling. And a couple of years ago, one of my clients, when he was introducing me, we'd had a bit of a chat, and he asked me, have I always been a speaker? And I told him I used to be a midwife. And some people are like, well, it's a chalk and cheese. And when he introduced me in front of the crowd, he introduced me as the story midwife. And it's kind of stuck, because I do still bring life into the world, but very different. I encourage people to bring their stories into the world. So I still feel as though I've got a wonderful position of privilege, being able to nurture and birth those stories. So, sometimes in life we don't get to choose. We get sent on this huge detour, and hopefully the detour ends up to be a scenic route. So there's not a day that goes by when I don't miss being a midwife, but I absolutely love what I do now.
What a beautiful story. Yeah, that is just wonderful. And it just strikes me like this, connecting the dots backwards. And now you're really into speaking and telling stories, and having lost your hearing, it just kind of like strikes me as, well, obviously that was the next step. If you lose something, right, then you really want to highlight it and make this your thing now because you gained it back. And it's just, yeah, it just
Yeah,
gives
and I
me
hadn't really
goosebumps.
thought about it at the time. I had no idea. I was lost for quite some time,
Right.
and in that space of, why me and what am I going to do? And yeah, I felt sorry for myself for a while, which is that
Of
natural sort of
course.
grieving process. But I remember I had an interview on radio, and when they wrote up the blurb for the interview, they gave the piece the title, "In Losing Her Hearing, She Discovered Her Voice." And I thought, I
Yeah.
like that. I'm going to
Yeah.
use that. And it's true. And I remember when I went to see the professor, in order to get onto the research trial, it was competitive and he only had so many places. He had a lot of people who could have done with being part of the program. And we did all the clinical tests and the sort of health related questions. And then he turned to me and he said, I've got more people who could benefit than there are places available. If I choose you to be on the program, how will you share the gift? And I had no idea what he was talking about. I really was sort of stumped. And I looked at him and I said, "Oh, I'll become a better listener."
Mm.
And he said, "Okay." And I thought, well, that would be a good step. We can all do with becoming a better listener. And it was only several years down the track that I thought my role in life, my purpose is now to help others to use their voice because I've discovered mine.
Yeah, it's beautiful. When you were speaking, also, I paid attention when you said, well, I paid attention all the time, but when you said, I learned to listen and speak differently. And I think you highlighted that before. So I'm curious, how is it different now?
Yeah, it's a good question. The sound that I get from the cochlear implant is artificial and
Hmm.
it sounds completely different to natural sound.
Hmm.
And so you not only have to learn to hear, but you've got to lay down new neural pathways in order to be able to turn that sound into something that resembles human speech. And initially, when you get the device and you have the sort of the turning on ceremony, you can't hear anything at all. It is completely artificial and it just sounds like noise. And because I've got a small amount of natural sound remaining, my brain has to merge those two signals together, the artificial sound that comes from the device and the natural sound that I'm hearing. So you're bypassing the natural way of hearing. So it's very much a learned process and it takes a huge amount of focus and a lot of rehabilitation in learning to, and maybe it's a lot easier for younger people who get a cochlear implant. And I also think that it's potentially easier for people who have never heard, who were born deaf. I mean, you've got to have a particular type of hearing loss to be able to get a cochlear implant. It's not
Hmm.
suitable for everybody. But yeah, it was a considerable journey and a lot of frustration and a
Yeah.
lot of trial and error with the amazing research team.
Yeah. Yeah. Just to tell you from, the outside, and listeners don't see that, but if you're watching the YouTube video, whenever I speak, I really see on your face how you're listening intensely. And obviously now I know your story and I know why, but it's just so beautiful to have someone listen to you so intensely. It feels like, wow, she's really taking in my information and paying attention to me. So I can see the really huge benefit, and I'm sure all your clients are like, wow, I really feel heard and seen by Lisa.
Thank you. That's a compliment. I hope they feel that way too.
Yes. So we are getting to wrap up, but I would like you, if you can, to just share some final encouragement and maybe tips that you could think of for someone who's struggling with this idea of telling stories.
Yeah. So look around you. There is a story in everything, whether it is a trip to the supermarket or remembering your first day at school or applying for a job, getting turned down for a promotion. Yeah, these are all potential story opportunities. Write them down, capture them, and remember that every story does need to have a point or a purpose. So ask yourself, how did I feel? What did I learn? And what's that lesson that I want to share with others? And remember that the most important story is the one that we tell ourselves. So do the inner work, to get rid of those unhelpful stories that no longer serve us, that perhaps we've had hanging around for a long, long time. Because if you have got whatever your own story is, you get to choose what the next chapter is. It's in your
Mm,
control. Yeah, get
mm.
out there and share your stories. Start off small, but other people are always fascinated by our stories because humans are hardwired to tell stories. We've
Mm.
always done it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to repeat the point and purpose. That's
Mm.
what I really take away. And the reason and season. That's a good one an easy one to remember as well. Like every story needs a reason, and there needs to be the season needs to be right and feel right to you as well. This has been very beautiful. Thank you so much for this conversation, Lisa. Do tell us, I have one more question, but before that, do tell us where people can connect with you, where they can find out more about your work.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. I love your work, Sarah. People can connect with me via my website, speakingsavvy.com.au. I'm also on LinkedIn. Always happy to have a chat and share a story with anyone online. So I do a complimentary discovery call. And obviously, I love hearing stories. So that's how people can best reach out to me.
Wonderful. And then my last question is, what are you grateful for today or this week, Lisa?
Today, this is probably going to sound strange, we're the opposite sides of the world. I'm grateful today that's a little bit cooler. I was actually able to have a good night's sleep. The 1st of March, we're now in autumn here in Australia. And so we've got temperatures that are really beautiful, and to see the flowers and the birds and the breeze. So today I'm grateful for the wonderful climate that I live in here in Perth, Western Australia.
Wonderful. Yeah, the sun is shining today here too, but I could use some warmer temperatures as well. Thank you so much for taking the time, Lisa. It's been an absolute delight.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks so much for watching and being part of a generation of marketers who cares for yourself, for your clients, and for the planet. We really are change makers before we are marketers. So go ahead, be the change you want to see in the world. And I hope to see you again next week. Take care.